I'm really, really happy, kind of honored to present Edleeca Thompson, Edleeca Payne Thompson. Just found out she's not quite Dr. Thompson yet, although everything but the final university signatures are in. And just a short bio of soon to be Dr. Thompson. She earned her BA and BFA in art history and studio art from UT Austin. She also received an MFA in studio art from UNT, with a major in ceramics and a minor in photography. She's really kind of covered the bases. She worked as curator of exhibitions and collections at the African American Museum here in Dallas. And she also pursued an MA in art history at SMU before coming to us at UT Dallas. She served on local, state, and national fine arts panels and acquisitions committees, has curated local and national exhibitions, and has presented exhibitions of her own work in photography and ceramics. She began her teaching career in the Dallas Community College districts as a photography instructor at Mountain View College in 1991. Has taught both art appreciation and art history courses at a number of local schools, including Eastfield College, Collin County Community College, Texas A&M Commerce, at UT Arlington. She's currently a full-time faculty member at Dallas College School of Creative Arts, Entertainment, and Design. She's helped develop a lot of courses for them as well. And I should just note, from a personal level, that I stepped in on her dissertation at a relatively late stage, replacing Dr. Rick Bertel, the late lamented and very, very important figure here at EODIA, and also extremely important in this dissertation. And I have to say, I came in relatively late, in the last 6 months, and I have rarely had the honor of serving on a dissertation that has been so well presented to me. I mean, it was in good hands before I joined. It was a pleasure to read and be a part of the process, especially knowing that so much had already been done. It was a dream to read and edit through the final stages. It was a really, really, it's a real honor, I think, to present, and also it's a real credit to our university and to our program. So I like that too. I think it reflects very well on us, but I also think Edleeca really deserves the credit for something that really does seem to be informed by a lifetime of work leading up to it. I mean, it really is sort of like a summa of a lot of incredible research and thought. So without any further ado, I'm really happy to present or to introduce soon to be Dr. Edleeca Thompson.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosen, and thank you for coming in after certainly Dr. Bertel. And thank everyone for joining me today. And as I go through my talk, I'd like for you all to think about the first time you saw African art and how the context or the way it was displayed helped to shape your own understanding of that art and culture. Today, I want to explore the role of African art in displays at the Dallas Museum of Art, including the Arts of Man exhibition from 1962 and others up to the present day. This talk was born out of dissertation research into how museums mediated the presentation of the art between its contextual significance within the museum and the cultural reasons for which it was originally produced. In that research, I compared 4 museums with distinct audience demographics and display practices with respect to African art: the Metropolitan Museum of Art, otherwise known as the Met, the Dallas Museum of Art, the Fowler Museum at UCLA, and the National Museum of African Art. And while all of these museums differed in the scope and variety of African art objects in their displays, the meteoric growth of their collections during the 1960s civil rights era reflected a shared purpose to collect African art in response to the needs of African American communities. The Dallas Museum of Art is unique in this regard because at the time, the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts, or DMFA, was located in what is now the Museum of Nature and Science building in Fair Park in South Dallas. While the DMFA's most generous benefactors, Eugene and Margaret McDermott, made it clear that they wanted to build an African art collection for the benefit of the surrounding Black communities, the city was lagging far behind in its efforts to desegregate its schools in response to the May 1954 Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education ruling. Shortly after the historic Supreme Court ruling, the museum hosted its first exhibition featuring African art entitled African, Oceanic, and Pacific Primitive Artifacts. In December of the same year, the DMFA held a series of school concerts and events co-sponsored by the Mu Phi Epsilon fraternity of music professionals and the DMFA Museum League. In what could be considered an attempt by the museum to present an image of inclusiveness, the activities were advertised as featuring the holiday music of Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish faiths. The Lincoln High School Harry T. Burley Choir performed Christmas standards, while other students dramatized a nativity scene, complete with wise men, the Virgin Mary, and an African-American baby Jesus. And this was an important event to document because this is the first known visual record of Black students visiting the museum. And in my interview with John Lunsford, he viewed this event as an example of Jerry Bywater's and the DMFA's forward-looking open-mindedness to invite Black students to the museum, considering that all Dallas schools were completely segregated at the time. And by the way, this is John Lunsford's birthday. He would be 88 years old today, so I want to wish his spirit a happy birthday. In 1961, city leaders hired the Bloom Advertising Agency to produce a short film entitled Dallas at the Crossroads. This was distributed to major Dallas media outlets, and the film was designed to depict a progressive city in the midst of growth and change. During a time of upheaval and violence in Chicago, Mississippi, Alabama, and other southern states, city leaders became anxious that violence could also erupt at home. Author Glenn Linden has commented that it was deemed necessary to create sufficient support for desegregation among influential individuals in order for it to be accepted in Dallas. However, the film did not feature any African Americans and instead emphasized the law and order aspect for the citizens of Dallas to comply with the Supreme Court desegregation ruling. In concert with civil rights movements across the country, interest in making connections between African art and African American culture had grown. Mrs. Margaret McDermott, president of the Dallas Art Association, also became interested in exhibiting African art. And in February of 1961, the museum hosted a traveling exhibition, The Sculpture of Negro Africa, organized by the Stopler Galleries in New York and the Art Center in La Jolla, California. Most of the works were chosen for their sculptural qualities rather than their anthropological importance, and were from countries most familiar to Western audiences, such as the Ivory Coast, the French Sudan, and Congo. And as you can see in the image on the left, a number of works, including ballet masks, a Shiwara headdress, and a Kota reliquary figure, were simply mounted on the wall at eye level. In the example on the right, figure sculpture and headdresses from Mali and the Ivory Coast were displayed on pedestals atop bricks on the gallery floor. Strategically placed lighting was used to cast shadows and emphasize contours and textures, particularly with the Bamana Shiwara headdresses. Certainly from the time Westerners became more interested in African art up to the 1960s, the types of objects collected were primarily figure sculpture and masks. This slide of a Congo display from the African Sculpture Exhibition at the National Gallery of Art from 1970 reveals a particular formula for displaying African art that was widely used by museums and galleries throughout the United States. Objects from the most familiar regions of West Africa and Congo were generally arranged geographically with dramatic lighting to convey sort of the mysterious nature of the objects. Spotlighting was used to cast shadows and emphasize textures and form, while the isolation of individual objects focused attention on formal aesthetic qualities. The inclusion of organic matter in the galleries or with the displays themselves, such as plants or rocks, was used to evoke the sort of rustic jungle-like nature of the African environment. And in another interview with John Lunsford, he commented that a precedent for displaying African art in museums had been set by the Museum of Primitive Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art with the work of René de Harnoncourt, who had been appointed director of the Museum of Modern Art in 1949. And what you see here is an example of the influence of de Harnoncourt's signature technique of creating open gallery spaces that he called vistas in attempts to, quote, present the object in an atmosphere closely related to that from which it was created, and to recreate the experience of the traveler going from one country to another. After the Sculpture of Negro Africa exhibition, the museum would launch its most ambitious project to date. With Margaret McDermott as the guiding force, the DMFA presented one of the largest exhibitions in the museum's 50-year history. Spanning almost 5,000 years of human creativity from pre-dynastic Egypt to the modern era, the Arts of Man, a selection of world art from ancient to modern times, included over 500 works borrowed from some of the most prestigious public and private collections in the world. The brochure that you see on the left highlighted works from Europe, Persia, China, India, Mesoamerica, and Africa. The Benin bronze figure of a standing king from Nigeria commands the center of the announcement around which all other representative works are arranged. This work, along with the famous bronze plaque of an equestrian oba and attendants from the Museum of Primitive Art, were the oldest works from sub-Saharan Africa in the exhibition. And Lunsford commented that the more naturalistic sculptures were more agreeable to European trained eyes, particularly the African figural works of the Benin court. So the role of African art in this context allows museum audiences in Dallas to view so-called primitive peoples as having a measure of cultural refinement with power structures and social hierarchies equal to those of Western civilization. At the time of the exhibition, the DMFA only had 13 full-time staff members. Let me repeat that, 13 full-time staff, which also consisted of part-time teaching staff of about 8 artists and art educators. The entire museum, all 15 galleries, hallways, and sculpture court were devoted solely to the exhibition. Objects were arranged chronologically by time period, beginning with pre-dynastic Egypt to the Hellenistic period, Byzantium, medieval and Renaissance Europe, and then the United States. The last gallery included Africa, Oceania, and American Indian art, as well as European and Japanese art. To accomplish the task of guiding visitors through the gallery spaces, John Lunsford devised an exhibition flow chart for visitors with galleries arranged in chronological order according to time period. And this chart was also included in the catalog for the exhibition. Sub-Saharan African art makes its debut into the exhibition during 16th century European exploration of distant lands and reemerges during the late 19th and early 20th centuries as the foundations of modern art. In the front hall and gallery A of the exhibition, works by Pablo Picasso, Paul Cézanne, and others were located near cases featuring Aboriginal, Native American, and African objects. The Egyptian display retained its place in the chronological timeline of human history in concert with ancient Middle Eastern and early Mediterranean cultures. An important component of this exhibition was its educational programming. Working with the Dallas Independent School District, the DMFA organized Saturday morning world history classes for high school students. The teaching reference was the textbook, The History of Our World by Arthur E. R. Boak, published in 1961. Lecture material and accompanying slides of works on display in the exhibition follow the chronological sequence of the units in the textbook. However, the world history lecture departs from Boak's text to remind students to, quote, look more closely at the arts of modern primitive peoples, because some peoples today still live under nearly the same primitive conditions as Stone Age man. And in my dissertation, I've argued that educational programs such as these world history classes and others during this time point to one of the inherent problems with displaying traditional African art, a problem that tends to essentialize and affix the art and culture of said modern primitive peoples to a specific frozen moment in time, outside of a realistic continuum of human artistic and intellectual development. After making a big splash onto the National Museum scene with the Arts of Man exhibition, the McDermotts set their sights on establishing a new collection area for the DMFA. As a member of the New York Arts Council, Margaret McDermott became friends with art broker Ida Rubin, who later introduced the McDermotts to African art collectors Clark and Francis Stillman. Across the country, formal comparisons to modernism continued to drive the collecting of African figure sculpture. In the quest to establish such a distinguished collection as the Stillmans, the McDermotts needed to test the interest of the Dallas audiences with the Art of the Congo exhibition in 1967, which was organized by the Walker Arts Center. Along with riding the wave of making modernist connections with primitive sculpture, I've also argued that race was clearly a factor at the highest levels of DMFA leadership to host exhibits of African art in order to appeal to the local African American community. During a 1968 Board of Trustees meeting on the Art of the Congo exhibition, board members discussed, quote, nominating a Negro to the board to attract more African Americans to the DMFA. This level of intensity highlights the problem the museum was having with its image as an inclusive institution, which at the time possessed only 2 drawings by African American artists in its collection. The solution to this image problem would present itself in the form of a major purchase of a collection that would not only attract more African American audiences, but one that would also position the DMFA as a serious contender for the collection of African art in the Southwest. Director Merrill Rupel wasn't really involved in the acquisition process, which was primarily handled by the McDermotts. Made possible through the generosity of the Eugene and Margaret McDermott Foundation, the DMFA finalized the acquisition of the Clark and Francis Stillman collection in 1969, which was the same year that Nelson Rockefeller announced moving the Museum of Primitive Arts collection to the Met. For the McDermotts, another incentive for acquiring the collection was to bridge racial divides and to, quote, present the extraordinary cultural heritage of Dallas's African American citizens. This seemed appropriate at the time since the museum was located in Fair Park in the predominantly African American neighborhood of South Dallas. Julia Scott Reed, Dallas native and champion for the Black community with her open line column in the Dallas Morning News, observed in her review of the inaugural Stillman exhibition that African art is as strange to Negro students as it is to whites or any other race, because it historically has been pretty much unknown to them. Now, the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts has a collection of Congo sculpture on permanent display that is not only relevant to their search for Black identity, but fits well into the pattern of broadening their knowledge of African history and development of race pride. This image included with Reed's article showing Black students from Hassell Elementary examining African art from the Stillman collection was staged to present a positive image of African American youth admiring the art of their ancestry. Nevertheless, residing within this perceived politics of inclusion was a patent disengagement with the adult African American community, because most of the museum programming catered almost exclusively to Black youth. Recognizing the Stillman collection as one of the finest in the world, the McDermotts also funded the renovation of an existing gallery, as well as the construction of special display cases to accommodate the collection. By 1970, the Clark and Francis Stillman collection of Congo sculpture had found a permanent home in the new Congo Gallery at the museum. Assistant Director Barney Delabano designed and installed all of the displays, while Associate Curator John Lunsford researched the art and assisted with installation. Due to the small size of the works, almost all of the pieces were grouped geographically in wall-length vitrines with recessed lighting from above. Just 2 years later, Lunsford organized the African Art from Dallas Collections exhibition, which featured over 300 works from local private collections. Works from the newly acquired Stillman collection of Congo sculpture were also included, and many objects were arranged based on ritual and aesthetic combinations. The inclusion of evergreen plants and foliage was still a common practice with displays of African art, as well as lighting to cast shadows for dramatic effect. In 1973, after Eugene McDermott passed away, Margaret explored adding to the DMFA's African collection in honor of her husband. Former assistant director and chair of education at the Met, Harry Parker III, was hired as director of the DMFA in January of 1974. Parker was familiar with the range and quality of works in the Gustav and Franjo Schindler collection of African sculpture previously exhibited at the Museum of Primitive Art. When this collection became available for purchase, Parker was involved in negotiations for its acquisition by the DMFA. The 50 masks and sculpture acquired through the newly established Eugene McDermott Foundation extended the size and geographical range of the collection to West Africa, including Mali, Guinea, the Ivory Coast, Liberia, Ghana, and Nigeria. And by 1974, with the Stillman and Schindler acquisitions, the DMFA held the most prestigious collection of African art in the Southwest. In 1979, the African collection was reinstalled in the newly renovated West Wing of the museum near the Sculpture Lounge and just across from the 20th Century Galleries. While the DMFA possessed fewer works of modern art than the Met, it did house a substantial collection of classical sculpture that it displayed in galleries adjacent to its other non-Western collections. As Dell'Urbano's only second design for African art, the Stillman and Schindler installations were typical of African gallery designs of the period. Working with a budget only a fraction of other museums as the Met, the DMFA was limited on works it could place in freestanding vitrines. Interestingly, John Lunsford comments that although the Schindlers were very impressed with the installation of the Stillman collection, they insisted that their collection be displayed separately from the Stillmans. Even with these monumental exhibitions and acquisitions, racial conflict continued to plague the city of Dallas, and donors and powerful museum patrons would affirm their plans to relocate the museum out of Fair Park and its southern Dallas neighborhood. Designed by Edward Larrabee Barnes, when the DMA's new downtown location opened to the public in January of 1984, Director Harry Parker stated that renaming the museum the Dallas Museum of Art was more appropriate in describing an inclusive collection which ranges from painting and sculpture to textiles and photographs, as well as African masks and pre-Columbian pottery. In the new floor design, the African Gallery was located in the northern wing, bordered by the pre-Columbian, Asian, and ethnic galleries. And all three spaces surrounded a smaller classical gallery, which then flowed into adjacent galleries for European and American art. Money was not an issue for the new museum, as citizens of Dallas had approved ample financial support through a bond election. All of the special casework was designed and built by the German case manufacturer Gunschel at a cost of over $1 million. Unfortunately, Dell'Urbano and Lunsford's role in the planning for the new galleries and displays were minimized as Barnes exacted full control over the design and color scheme. Plans for the Ancient Art of the Americas galleries followed identical designs as the African galleries, but casework was more integrated into the architecture with massive floor-to-ceiling vitrines for smaller objects. And as you can see, the architecture clearly dominated the display program by imposing a template through which to organize all of the non-Western galleries. As visitors moved through the gallery spaces, the overall environment, color scheme, and lighting remained almost identical from one gallery to the next. I have argued that this approach, while placidly innovative for its time, emphasized a visual encounter with the art as scripted through the architecture. Consequently, visitor interpretation of the art and the subtleties of meaning as distinct and unique to each culture group become universalized. Objects from geographically distanced regions of Africa, Oceania, and Native America are now presented as a collective unit through a series of galleries in one wing of the museum dedicated to the arts of the non-Western world. In the span of only 3 years after opening at its new downtown location, the DMA hosted 3 major traveling exhibitions featuring African art. They included Primitivism in 20th Century Art, Affinity of the Tribal and the Modern, in collaboration with the Museum of Modern Art, Ancestral Art of Gabon, featuring the works from the Barbier-Mueller collection, and Art Artifact, organized by the Center for African Art in New York City. All of these exhibitions forecasted shifting contextual themes through which African art could be displayed and interpreted. The most defining moment for the DMA at its new downtown location was the Primitivism in 20th Century Art exhibition. And once again, Mrs. McDermott would lend her support to secure this monumental show for the museum. Her strategy for acquiring the exhibition hinged on the DMA receiving the most famous work in MoMA's collection, Pablo Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. In return, Mrs. McDermott agreed to fund all printing costs for the 2-volume exhibition catalog. Enough has been written about the essentializing nature of the exhibition and its use of non-Western art as a filter through which to aggrandize modernism. As you see here, masks from the dawn of the Ivory Coast, the Atombe, Pende, and Songhai of the Congo were displayed high on a wall adjacent to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. Divorced from their original costumes and wearer, viewers are only able to interpret the objects as formal sources for Western artistic innovation and to remind them of the primitive inspiration for Picasso's famous painting. The politics of displaying African art as art in museums was first explored in 1988 by Susan Vogel at the Center for African Art in New York City with the exhibition Art Artifact. 9 museums across the United States, including the DMA, hosted the exhibition, which explored the various display contexts for African art throughout history. The national controversy surrounding the Primitivism in 20th Century Art exhibition also sparked more interest in exploring the continuity between African art and art of the diaspora. Organized by the DMA's first adjunct curator of African American art, Alvia Wardlaw, Black Art Ancestral Legacy, the African Impulse in African American Art, was the first major traveling exhibition connecting African artistic traditions with African American art. In 1992, under the direction of Jay Gates, the DMA hired University of Iowa professor of African art Christopher Roy to research the collection and to serve as adjunct curator. During Roy's tenure, textiles and objects associated with kingship were acquired to expand the socio-political scope of the collection. The 1992 reinstallations provided ample space to display larger works in the round on open pedestals, such as the Baga Dimba headdress from the Schindler collection. Objects were still grouped geographically, and although light levels were raised to minimize stark contrasts, the overall gallery lighting remained subdued in a monochromatic color scheme of browns and grays. Spotlighting the masks from above creates depth through cast shadows, emphasizing form and contours. In my opinion, this approach also reinforces the disembodied character of the masks in the museum setting, as they seem to float aimlessly on the walls without any direction from their user. A most recent example of this lighting technique I observed in some of the displays at the Congo Masks Masterpieces from Central Africa exhibition at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in 2019. Although the masks were mounted closer to eye level in this exhibition, lighting designed to cast shadows was essentially the same as the DMA example from 1992. By 1989, Nancy Hammond had provided the initial $20 million in funds to build a new wing that would add over 140,000 square feet of space for the DMA's non-Western collections. Designs for the new Hammond wing rejected the standard chronological arrangement of museum galleries by time period, and instead organized display spaces by continent. The brilliant and ambitious museum director at the time, Richard Bertel, was excited for Larrabee Barnes to create a whole new museum design with galleries that were geographically and temporally conceived and accessible from one entrance. This was the first of its kind in the United States, and in 1993, the Nancy and Jake Hammond wing opened to the public with a new presentation of the DMA's collections, including the arts of the Americas, arts of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, arts of Europe, and the arts of the contemporary world. On the left is a floor plan of the non-Western galleries in the new wing, which was designed to present the collections in adequate space and clear geographic groupings for the first time, and to present Egypt and sub-Saharan Africa as distinct areas within a larger African whole. By 1994, Ramona Austin had become the DMA's first full-time African-American curator of African art, hired to facilitate the reinstallation of the African galleries after the expansion. On the right, Austin's preliminary drawings for the African Gallery organized displays geographically into 6 sub-Saharan regions, including Western Sudan, Guinea Coast, Nigeria, Equatorial Africa, Central Africa, and Eastern and Southern Africa. During the planning stages, Austin identified some of the problems with displays of African art, commenting that, quote, the lines are getting blurred between ethnological presentation and aesthetic presentation. And by this time, a more pedagogical approach to displaying African art had been adopted as proposed by founder of the National Museum of African Art at the Smithsonian, Warren Robbins. The DMA's 1996 reinstallation of the Arts of Africa Gallery revealed this new educational approach by including more large-scale contextual photographs, expanded historical label copy, and a wall-sized map of Africa with object icons linked to country of origin. The addition of more utilitarian items, such as knives, granary doors, and musical instruments, also necessitated additional didactic information in relation to other works in the collection. Although more objects were displayed in freestanding vitrines, light levels remained subdued in harmony with a darker color scheme of walls and casework. In 2003, under Director Jack Lane and Deputy Director Bonnie Pittman, Rosalind A. Walker was hired as the Margaret McDermott Curator of African Art. As former director of the National Museum of African Art, Walker was charged with expanding the scope, quality, and thematic range of the African collection at the DMA. However, as late as 2013, the African Gallery had essentially remained unchanged since the 1996 installation, with only minor adjustments as new works were added to the collection. In the fall of 2012, the DMA received a grant from the Texas Fund for Curatorial Research, sponsored by UTD and the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History, to aid in research for the reinstallation of the African Gallery. The grant provided support for myself and Dr. Walker to visit no less than 25 United States and European museums with recently installed African collections. The purpose of our visits was to observe and record the best practices in exhibit design in anticipation of the DMA's reinstallation of the African Gallery in 2015. And this research was also the inspiration for my dissertation. Some of the considerations for the African Gallery reinstallation we explored included the location of the African Gallery in the museum and the various conversations between spaces and other galleries, having a balance of thematic and geographical displays, acknowledging contemporary art, social issues, and histories of the works in the collection, color and lighting in the galleries, to vitrine or not to vitrine, having a balance of freestanding works and vitrines in the gallery, having flexible displays with ease of rotation, as well as the use of technology in the galleries and accessibility with displays and didactics. In the 2015 reinstallation, works were arranged according to 5 thematic groupings: arts of governance, arts in the cycle of life, decorative arts and design, the impact of trade, and masking. An important consideration in the redesign of the African Gallery was to create a flexible space without attached walls or vitrines so that objects could easily be rotated. Here you can see the difference between the displays from 2012 to the reinstallation in 2015. White walls and cases replaced the taupe color scheme from the 1990s, while smaller objects, formerly mounted in wall cases with bonnet lighting, are now mounted at eye level with articulated platforms for labels and didactics. At the west entrance, visitors are greeted by a large freestanding Yoruba ancestor figure from Nigeria that faces another ancestor figure in the Pacific Islands Gallery. This section features works highlighting the impact of trade and the role of European colonialism in Africa. One of the most striking displays in this section points to direct European involvement in the trade of ivory, slaves, and liquor during colonialism. On the left, the carved ivory tusk in the center narrates a story of typical 19th century life along the Luango coast of the Congo. On the right is a detail of a photographic rollout of the tusk with scenes of porters transporting cargo. Carefully detailed African figures wearing traditional and European clothing, as well as African slaves in chains, visually recount a journey of goods and people. Next to this object, an effigy vessel depicts a seated male figure in European attire holding a liquor bottle in one hand and a drinking cup in another. Shifting away from a monochromatic color scheme, display areas use red and yellow accent walls to designate each thematic grouping. Strategically placed larger explanatory panels outline the general function of the objects on display, while increased light levels, as well as reflected light from white walls and ceiling, create a brighter and more inviting space for visitors. In the course of the renovation, a skylight at the east end of the gallery was opened to allow natural light to enter the space. In the Art of Governance section, headwear indicating social status are displayed with staffs, royal finials, and a sword ornament associated with kingship and political rule. In the slide on the right, objects such as a beaded cap in the form of a white wig worn by British barristers, displayed with a Yoruba crown and other objects, reveals the influence of European colonialism and the adaptation of Western forms in African art. At both the Eastern and Western entrances, introductory panels explain the African art objects in the DMA's collection in the context of collecting, artist identity, original purpose, figural emphasis, and materials. In the left slide, one of the oldest African artworks outside of Egypt, the Sokoto fragment of a male figure faces the Egyptian gallery, supporting cross-cultural dialogue with ancient Egypt. On the right, near the center of the gallery, a section displaying masks and headdresses highlights a variety of objects used in African masquerade performances. Large print labels and enlarged contextual photographs have been incorporated into the displays, as with the Bamileke elephant mask and hat section. Unlike the 1996 installation that displayed the Baga Dimba headdress from Guinea on an enclosed vitrine, the headdress now towers over viewers and appears in full masquerade costume. Visitors can also access additional information on the objects on display through the DMA's MOBI application. Articulated platforms feature didactics and audio-video components for greater visitor accessibility. And a majority of the masks and sculpture are also now freed from vitrine restraints, allowing visitors to have a closer look at the works, unencumbered by reflections and harsh shadows. And while these changes reflect how the DMA and other museums are rethinking how they display and interpret African art in their permanent collections, they are also being pushed to decolonize those collections and to be more transparent about the historical contexts and provenances of their objects. One way museums can engage in these conversations is through temporary exhibitions, like The Power of Gold, Ashanti Royal Regalia from Ghana from 2018. The story of an Ashanti gold sword ornament in the form of a spider, signifying African Ashanti kingship, eventually making its way from Ghana to Britain, New Mexico, and Austin, Texas, to its final resting place at the DMA, opens the door to a myriad of important historical narratives surrounding the journey of the art. Making connections with local audiences is important, as well as making transnational connections in relation to the things that are important to people's lives and livelihoods. In a temporary space adjacent to the Egyptian gallery, textiles from the museum's permanent collection illustrate the rich tradition of silk cloth production in the Moth to Cloth exhibition. Tracing the origins of silk from the silk moths in Madagascar to cocoon cultivation, silk production, and trade, the exhibition highlights the importance of this material in the context of world economics and cross-cultural exchange. Emphasizing transcontinental ties via travelers and traders along the Silk Road, museum visitors can continue their journey to the adjacent Asian gallery and view works from India, Tibet, and China. The installations I've just shown you from the DMA's African art collections are a reflection of the new approaches to display we are seeing in museums across the country. How the museum has mediated its histories with a collection and display of African art reflects the various roles African art has played at the Dallas Museum of Art. In concert with the 1960s civil rights movements, interest in making connections between African art and African American culture grew exponentially across the country. While African art has consistently maintained an aesthetic role as the foundations of modern art, the Arts of Man exhibition in 1962 allowed Dallas Museum audiences to recognize that the skill and sophistication of art of the Benin Court could rise to the level of Western art. Just a few years later, the DMA's most influential benefactors, Margaret and Eugene McDermott, acquired the Stillman Collection of Congo sculpture, which was one of the most revered collections of African art in the United States at the time. They did this in the midst of criticism from donors, in the midst of civil rights and desegregation efforts, as well as vehement racism in Dallas. That took guts, plain and simple. But for the McDermotts, it was about bringing African art to the museum for the benefit of the African American community and the race pride that it could engender. The move downtown was another defining moment for the DMA. African art began to take on a more educational role, and its connection to African American traditions and art were realized in the Black Art Ancestral Legacy exhibition. The DMA was also the first museum in the United States to reorganize its galleries according to continent instead of time period or artistic tradition, thereby returning Egypt back to the African continent. However, the most problematic area with the DMA's African gallery remains its proximity to the American gallery and the aesthetic relationships between the art they each contain. Perhaps incorporating more African American art in the American gallery and more contemporary African art in the African gallery could provide better visual and contextual relationships between the two. The push to decolonize museums around the globe has forced them to respond to questions about the manner in which works in their collections were acquired. Highlighting the role of European colonialism, slavery, addressing the looting of African art, and including other transnational histories illuminates important historical contexts surrounding the journey of the art. Installations in the DMA's permanent gallery with the impact of trade, as well as in temporary exhibitions such as The Power of Gold, are effective ways to address some of these issues. In addition, the DMA has clearly embraced the use of technology, social media, and accessible displays to enhance viewer engagement with the art. The biggest challenge in this area is to understand the type of technology to use, the level of accessibility, and how these tools affect the way viewers see and understand the art. And my final thoughts are that I believe as we move further into the 21st century, museums find themselves in the midst of changing attitudes about the nature of their collections and the means through which they display and interpret those collections. The current secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, Lonnie Bunch, said that he believes in the educational potential of art museums in stimulating dialogue about the social, political, and racial injustices facing African Americans today. If this is true, museums like the DMA can continue to use their collections to have more difficult conversations about the African art on view in their galleries and its connection to the histories, lives, and experiences of people of African descent. This is the end of my presentation. I thank you for listening, and I hope I've left time for questions.
Thank you so much, Edleeca. We do have time, and I mean, and please, for those of you who, you're welcome to turn your cameras on and show yourselves. If you want to use your hand function, if you have a question, I'd be happy to begin while people are kind of putting their cameras on. My question for you to begin is, you have this wonderful, and this is an important part of your dissertation, photos of the exhibitions, where the first members of the Black community are coming to see, or brought to see these objects, and and that those are sort of the only examples we really know of community engagement, that sort of school children. And I mean, so I have sort of two questions. Like, one is, does that manifest in any way? Like, is there, is there a result from those visits that we know of, and beyond just these sort of documented photos? Is there a growing interest that kind of snowballs out of that? And then the second is sort of, can you speak a little bit about how, steps that were taken much later, or in the later iterations of the museum, to do community engagement? And you do speak about that sort of in a general sense, but are there sort of more specific, and maybe, I mean, we have Rosalind Walker's here, but I wonder if maybe you can speak to any successful occasions of that you can think of.
Well, and I think I've stopped sharing my screen, right? I think I have. So as I mentioned, one of the earliest images, and there aren't very many, because in 1954, and a lot of those activities occurred just a few months after the Supreme Court ruling in December. The Supreme Court ruling was in May. And so there are very few images of Black students in the museum, but everything was very measured in time, because a lot of the documents that I reviewed in both the Bywaters collection and at the DMA's archives with Hilary Bober, I noted a lot of tours. There were a lot of school tours given, but one specific day for Black students for tours. They were very specific about that. And so there are very, very few images, very few photographs. Everything was measured, because even though, and this is again, Dallas, Texas, with a film like At the Crossroads in 1961, that was 7 years later. So, and there were really 2 high schools for Black students to go to. So, yeah, I'm not sure if that answers the first question, but everything was where African-American students were concerned in Dallas, Texas. Yeah, everything was very measured.
Does anybody have a question that they'd like to pose? Looking for the hands.
Hi there, hello. I have a question, if it's at all possible. Hi, my name is Cheryl Mitchell. I'm a professor at UT Arlington. I lead the Museum Studies program and the UTI Fine Art Collections, and we have a growing African art collection. So thank you for your research and your presentation today. I'm an avid fan of yours, Dr. Walker's, and Dr. Austin's, and have traced that kind of trajectory over the years. And so just kind of piggybacking onto Dr. Rosen's question, have you seen a much stronger dramatic change to that community outreach and through the opportunities for African-American students through K through 12 in Dallas and in the local areas? I went to a predominantly Black high school, Sam Houston High School, and we did not have a prominent art or art history program. And that's something I'd like to see remedied.
Yeah, we would.
Yeah, I think now, and certainly Roz, you can chime in terms of reaching out to the. I think there's been more since Roz has been here, reaching out to the adult Black community, and that was really an issue because when I talked to John Lunsford in the past, and actually Dr. Patel brought this up, it seemed that in the past, more outreach was toward youth. There were more kinds of things directed toward youth and not the adult Black population. And that was the big problem that the early DMFA had. That's why they were so, bent on trying to get a Negro board member on their board. That's in the records. They were having a huge issue with the adult Black population. And actually one of the reasons was because they didn't have any African-American art in their collection.
Yeah. I'll just chime in. Before the pandemic, before we closed, the education department had a program with the South Dallas Cultural Center to work with families, to bring families in, to invite families in for activities with me, visiting the galleries and also making art. And that was pretty successful because we did have parents coming with their children, which is just the best way to visit an art museum.
Yeah.
And then, so I hope we'll resume that when, times are better, when we get past this horrible year.
We'll get there.
Thank you.
Do we have others? I mean, that is a good thought to think about, sort of like the museum as a kind of the hearth or as the kind of gathering spot. I'm sure everybody here is missing that like so much. I mean, I know that plenty of museums are open again, but the, just imagining the kind of flow of people in and out and the big exhibitions that can travel and, all of those things that we're missing now, obviously.
And free admission has helped a lot. That was a very dramatic change that I've seen in my time here. So everybody is coming in. A lot of people who didn't visit before know we really want them to come in because they don't have to pay an admission. We just have to, yeah.
I was going to say, does anybody else want to chime in? I mean,
I was going to say there's a question that came in the chat from Dr. Sarah Kozlowski, who's the Associate Director of the O'Donnell Institute.
Okay.
And she says, thank you, Edleeca. I am not able to participate via video right now, but I would love to hear more from you and Roz about the role of the McDermotts in the building, in building the DMA holdings of African art.
Oh,
I think Edleeca made that very clear that Eugene had passed away by the time I got here, but Margaret was very serious about building the collection and its role. Yeah.
If well, I found a lot of information from prior interviews that Shati Lee had done with John Lunsford, and board minutes, combing through board minutes, at a lot of it at the DMA archives with Hillary. And so there was pushback. There was serious pushback from donors. The director, Meryl Ruppel, really was not involved. And I think John Lunsford said that there was at one point that because he kind of dragged his feet and then there was some tension between Ruppel and Mrs. McDermott, she took the reins and met with Ida Rubin and the Stillmans and acquired part of the collection. But there was some jockeying going on, and the Met apparently got a lot of other pieces that the DMA could have had. I mean, Mrs., when she wanted to have the art, she's like, I want to have an art of all of the world. That's what she came to John Lunsford about. And that's why I emphasize 13 staff. That's all they had at the DMFA to put that show together. But Mrs. McDermott was a force.
And a very short time too. Wasn't it about 6 months?
Oh yeah,
Some,
they did
you know,
research, they traveled, they,
yeah.
night and day.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I actually had a question, changing tacks a little bit. I've been thinking about the plans that you showed of the sort of map of the museum and the floor. And I'm thinking about the non-Western section with the classical that leads to the European, which is clearly problematic in a lot of ways. And I'm hearing you talk about how the American galleries up on the 4th floor that lead down into the African galleries there needs to be more of a relationship. If you were able to move walls and other collections and galleries, what would be your ideal setup in a museum like the DMA that is encyclopedic, that has so much crossover, but while still wanting to honor certain delineations, what would that look like to you?
Well, and that's kind of in a conversation I think I also had with Professor Bonnie Pittman. You know, what would be the solution if a museum doesn't have a multi-million-dollar, billion-dollar budget to change its design? And I would think about the visitor journey and line sights, because I watched people moving around and I watch what they look at and I listen to what they say, and it's like, should we go here? What's up there? Why is this here? This kind of thing. And actually I've had conversations with a couple of curators years ago when I was at the DMA about this issue, and they agree it is a problem. I think what I mentioned was perhaps using the art somehow to pull people from one space to another. If you're standing at the bottom of the stairs and I'm looking at, I think it might still be up there, the Murphy painting of the clock. What does that have to do with, you know, the African art in the gallery? Those kind of questions. And if I'm up at the top of the stairs and I'm going through, you know, is there a way to put African American art there, or another work of some kind to tie in to those spaces, to use what you already have to draw people in? That's what I admired about in reading about de Harnoncourt, is he always thought about where the viewer was, the visitor was, and what they could see ahead of them to sort of pull them forward. If that makes does that answer question kind of?
It does. I think it's actually a great idea, because I'm thinking about how you walk up those stairs and it is that painting that you're talking about, but just to the right is all of the sort of deck arts. You know, I mean, I don't know, there's something happening there, but I guess I was asking more in an ideal, right? In an ideal world where you could move entire galleries and collections like a puzzle piece. You know, I don't know. In an ideal world, what would an encyclopedic museum look like that honors the collection of African art in a way that both sets it apart, but creates a sort of narrative? I mean, it's hard to create a narrative like that, but that is linked but also separate. I was thinking of the plan. I can believe it, but with the non-Western section, the classical in the center that leads to the European art, that's a problematic.
Oh, in the old museum?
Yes.
Yeah. Well,
I mean,
and the thing is, I had to remind myself how they were, the role of African art at the time. And what John Lunsford was talking about, you know, in trying to bring African art to the Dallas audience was problematic, because and that's why they focused on figural work, naturalistic work, because people could relate to that, and the bronzes, the fine technique. So focusing on figural work, focusing on a sort of high-end technique of broadcasting, focusing on the imagery of kings, these kinds of areas, and not the more abstract stuff. He said people would not even could relate to that, and they would think of it as primitive. In fact, he said that one of the biggest things, the problem they were trying to do was find another word other than primitive. But
Yes,
even in their
yeah.
lecture material, they kept using the word primitive. So I to answer that question, crossing Africa to the Americas, I would have to think maybe historically along those lines. I remember having a conversation with Bonnie Pittman about African American quilts and the images in those.
Mhm.
And even, although it might even be, I mean, you could tie that textile kind of imagery, even though I'm kind of critical of the Met for doing this with Ella Natsui's work.
Yeah.
That's been overdone, I think.
Mhm.
But there are certain things, depending on the works, that you could flesh out. You could expand on with the works themselves beyond just the aesthetic, formal kinds of things, and really get into the meat of the meaning of the symbolism for contemporary African American artists, for contemporary African artists. So my thing is like bring that art into the conversation.
Thank you.
Dr. Levi has a question for you. I think we're past 5, so
Oh.
that's okay. I mean, we can keep going as long as there's interest. But Ali's got a question, so I think let's please ask it.
I'm sorry. Thank you so much for invigorating talk. I was just a little bit late walking in, but I wanted to just touch a point and sort of build on what Heather just talked about, and building this narrative, and something that you mentioned at the very end of the talk of avoiding the colonial history of sort of African art as sort of becoming dominant in label writing and sort of the presentation. What kind of challenges do you face? And this is just from my own experience of having taught Islam in medieval Africa this summer at Yodia, and sort of having to sort of have this constant sort of battle between representing Africa and African art in its own context without the colonial context of sort of the Islamic colonial context of West Africa. And so when you talked about the faces of it facing Egypt and facing sort of the Americas, or sort of being connected with the American galleries, so how do you avoid the colonial aspect of, I mean, with the challenge of decolonizing the museum as well, and sort of the narrative of Africa? It's a very loaded question, and I was just wondering if you had some examples that this is some challenges that you face.
I wouldn't avoid it. I wasn't sure that I want to, we need to have that conversation. It must be, to me, it must be included. And I think that's why I included the tusk. And a lot of when you really begin to look closely at that tusk, and then I've pulled the descriptive information, of course, that's there in the gallery. That's important to include, because I think you have to have the larger picture, and what's happened, and I think why there's so when people use that buzzword decolonization is because these things haven't been talked about. That's a part of the Islamic influence, is certainly a part of not only belief systems, but the social systems, political systems, aesthetics as well. And I think there are ways to have those conversations without putting people off. I think those are necessary conversations to have.
Right. I mean, what spurred this question actually was I take my students on a virtual tour of the African galleries at the British Museum, and when you kind of come to the Benin bronzes, the entire label, about 80% of it is of how the British sort of penalized the oboe and bring back the Benin bronzes, and not bring them back, sorry, loot them, essentially.
Right.
That takes up 80% of the label, and 20% basically on the bronzes themselves. And so this was one of the examples that I kind of gave them of sort of, you know, the how viewing African art from the colonial lens and it occupying actual physical space on the label is,
Right.
but it's also part of the historical, you know, narrative of the Benin bronzes for West. So that sort of tug of war is something that I find difficult as an educator. So.
And they are difficult conversations to have. And I think we're in this pendulum, and this pendulum has come this way. It's swung. And so somehow, and I have to find myself in, what is it that I really want my students to understand about this? I want them to know this history, but what is it? Do I want them to walk out of my class mad? Do I want to, or do I want them to have a better appreciation of the art? I'm coming from an art perspective. So I want them to understand this history, but I have to, I guess, be gentle enough to figure out what it is that I really want them to know also.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any final thoughts, or anybody want to chime in with any additional commentary? This has been great, and it seems like it's quiet. Thanks so much, Edleeca, for. I mean, and I have to, and I would like to say also that this is like one mega chapter out of a very substantially longer dissertation that deals with 3 other collections. Although, I mean, I think you had incredible access to the Dallas material, and really, I think you wrote a history that did not exist, in any really of incredible importance. And so, I also think that this will, like the written thing that you produced will be highly sought after. I mean, I think you've constructed, whether you turn it into the book, that gets published that way, or whether it's a dissertation that gets read that, either way, I think it will be, I feel very certain that people will be looking at it, and I would say that you should be very proud of that. And I think because it contains just so much information, and it has it has photos and, diagrams, and just everything that, one would want to see in these things. So beyond the analysis, I mean, which is wonderful, as everybody listening here would know. So thank you all very much for coming today. Again, Paul Galvez is our next speaker on the 29th of April. If you're on the EOD mailing list, you'll be seeing that coming up. There will also be, as we mentioned, conservation talks beginning in May. Heather will be sending things out for you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
Well
Thank you.
done.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.